When speaking of the PlayStation 2, there are some franchises that instantly pop into people's minds when thinking about that console. Ratchet & Clank, God of War, Gran Turismo, Sly Cooper, and of course, the Jak Daxter series. Jak Daxter being the series that I liked the least of the big three main platforming-esque games that were on the PlayStation 2 itself. I always had a bigger soft spot for Ratchet & Clank and the Sly Cooper series than the Jak Daxter series. That's not to say that the Jak Daxter series is bad. In fact, to many, the series of games for Jak Daxter are some of the best platformers in general for the genre, and with Precursor Legacy being one of the best collectathons in general. Do I agree with this sentiment? Not necessarily. It's kind of complicated, I will admit. But I will not deny that Precursor Legacy is a very well put together game. For myself, I honestly don't remember where or when I first played this game. I've been trying to recall for a while now, but I constantly draw blanks. I even went back to my old Let's Plays and live stream series to see if I had said where I had first played the game from. And honestly, even in there, I don't think that it's right with what I said inside of the live stream series. I'm about 80% positive that it was at a friend's house sometime after the game had launched in 2001, but I don't know really for certain myself. I did own the game after 2007 when I had my own PlayStation 2, but I know that I had played Jak Daxter: The Precursor Legacy before that time. A little bit of background on Precursor Legacy might be in order here, I suppose. Jak and Daxter were created by Naughty Dog as the first series to be a first-party franchise after being acquired by Sony after the success of the Crash Bandicoot franchise on the original PlayStation. Naughty Dog's engine for the game would be made to show off the power of the PlayStation 2. And although there were some slight delays and the game missed the launch window of 2000, the game was released publicly in 2001 to critical praise and high acclaim. The touting feature of Precursor Legacy was its minimal to no consistent loading times despite the rather large levels the game had at the time. Feeling as more of a step up from the Crash Bandicoot in terms of level design, graphics, and presentation, Jak and Daxter: The Precursor Legacy would also allow for the Ratchet & Clank series to thrive with the help of Naughty Dog allowing Insomniac Games to use the Jak and Daxter engine when making their own game. But while Precursor Legacy's technical achievements are well known and remembered, what of its story and its characters? Well, why don't we get into that now, shall we? Jak and Daxter begins with an opening monologue from Samos, the father figure to our mute protagonist Jak, and with what I'm going to assume is a guardian for Jak's best friend Daxter. We never really find out about Daxter's family honestly in the series, nor does the series care at this point. While traveling to Forbidden Island, Jak and Daxter overhear a conversation from the main villains of the game and their lurker army. After falling into a vat of dark eco, however, Daxter is transformed into a small and furry Ottsel, much to his and Jak's astonishment. From there, the main quest begins as, after reprimanding Jak and Daxter, Samos states that the only one who has studied Dark Eco long enough to change Daxter back would be Gul Acheron, the sage, who lives far to the north. The only way to reach him, though, is to travel across the Fire Canyon, since the teleporter gates that connect all the sages together have been turned off, and the Fire Canyon itself can melt the strongest metal in the entire world, which is that of Precursor metal. But Samos' daughter Kira happens to be developing a heat shield for her Zoomer to allow for travel across the Fire Canyon, but it is missing the crucial 20 power cells in order to activate the shield. So it is now up to Jak to travel around the neighboring areas and villages to collect power cells from the villagers and travel up north to change Daxter back to his normal self. And that's basically it. Your whole goal about the game is just to get north for the beginning, and then the plot changes around halfway through the game, but it would be in spoiler territory, and I'd rather not get into that right now. And there are some slight twists, but honestly, the plot sets itself up and the world rather nicely within the first 5 minutes of the game, which is something I can appreciate from a game in a new franchise. Each of the games begins in a similar way of building the world up from what we already know about it. But I find that Jak and Daxter: The Precursor Legacy gives the most mystery while also captivating when comparing it to other games in the series, bar none. Sadly though, the villains, while their plot is ever present, they appear far too infrequently and honestly become an afterthought to me whenever I'm playing the Precursor Legacy, which is a shame. It gets to a point when I'm at the end where I go, oh right, you're actually a thing. They also are easily discarded from the overall stories of the games after Precursor Legacy and aren't even really mentioned at all by the main cast in the later games, which is a shame. There's a slight cameo in a spin-off game, but that's pretty much it. Lurkers themselves also start out strong, but by the second game, you really only see one type of lurker, and by Jak 3, lurkers aren't even mentioned at all. It's like the series just died out with that, and as it was dying out, it was taking out characters with it. But as enemies for the first game, the lurkers are simply fine for what they are, that are obstacles to overcome. Overall, the story of the game is more secondary in Jak and Daxter, the Precursor Legacy, which is fine in this instance, and ironically enough, Naughty Dog would go full ham-fist into larger stories after this first game, not only for the Jak and Daxter series, but for all their series going forward overall, especially after this game. So if it isn't the story that is the main driving force for playing the Precursor Legacy, then its gameplay is more memorable, right? Let's get into that right now then, shall we? As mentioned earlier, Jak and Daxter: The Precursor Legacy feels like a natural evolution from the Crash Bandicoot franchise and formula in terms of gameplay. Gone are the linear corridors and restrictive cameras, as now is the time of sprawling, open worlds and 360-degree camera control. Gone is the linearity of level progression, as now it is an open-ended level progression with the ability to backtrack the levels to complete objectives if desired. The more open nature of Jak and Daxter: The Precursor Legacy when compared to that of Crash Bandicoot can be felt from the first level of the game alone, Geyser Rock. A level that is a tutorial that not only does everything that checks off the right check marks in my book, but it introduces the player to the mechanics and platforming that will be present throughout the entirety of Jak and Daxter: The Precursor Legacy, and most of the series as a whole. There are some mini-games that are available for the player to participate in for power cells within this game, but they are kept to a minimum within this first installment in favor of more platforming-centric challenges. This is why I love Precursor Legacy so much, because the core of its game is platforming, and it excels so well at it. But unfortunately, this would be something that the later Jak and Daxter games moved away from, resulting in more mini-games than platforming by the third entry in the series. Checkpoints are sprinkled in within the game, but given the larger focus on platforming rather than mini-games, the bosses aren't really a challenge that much either, and thus you don't really have that much of a problem of checkpointing and how it's handled in the Precursor Legacy. Checkpointing would become a much bigger problem by the second game given the shift in focus, but that's for other reasons we'll get into once we tackle Jak 2 for a review eventually. Of course, while platforming and collecting is the name of the game, the way you collect things varies. From precursor orbs littered on the floor that act as currency for power cells from other characters, different types of eco that can give you different power-ups temporarily. To touch on the ecos real quick, there are 4 main types encountered within the game for Jak to interact with: red, blue, yellow, and green. Red eco powers up attacks and is the least utilized eco in the game by far, with really only 2 wells of it being available for the player. Yellow eco allows you to launch fireball ranged attacks that have a slight homing property and is the second most used in the game. Blue eco allows for Jak to move faster, activate certain precursor artifacts, and breaks open boxes that allow also for precursor orbs to attract to him more easily. With blue eco, which is by far the most common type of eco to be used in the field, you have a lot of different platforming challenges to go along with it, and that's something that I can appreciate. Finally, green eco acts as health and is dropped by enemies, boxes, and can be collected into a clump of 50 to add more health to Jak for a total of 4 hit points overall. There are some sources of dark eco too, usually in crates or inside vast pools, but usually only in terms of causing explosions that can hurt Jak or outright killing him because of the nature of dark eco, thus causing the player to have to reset at the last checkpoint they were at. Levels in Jak and Daxter: The Precursor Legacy are rather varied in design and give off different details with their own unique challenges in the level. From dense jungles to underwater precursor cities to a volcanic crater, there are many different locales to visit in Precursor Legacy. The game only requires you to have 72 power cells out of the game's 101 to be collected in order to beat it. Certain levels in the end, as a result of needing only 72 power cells to complete it, can be skipped, but you do miss out on the true 100% ending, which is canon into getting into the second game in the series, Jak 2, as the second game begins where the 100% ending of Jak and Daxter: The Precursor Legacy leaves off. But overall, the gameplay very solid, very well put together, and mechanically works as intended. So the gameplay is more than enough to make up for it in every regard. But when tackling the sound direction, that is also something that helps elevate Precursor Legacy as well, and help give more of a feeling that this world is populated. So why don't we get into the sound design of Jak and Daxter, the Precursor Legacy right now.
Hey! It looks like the Blue Sage threw a party.
Oh my! Rock Village is on fire!
One heck of a party.
To start with voice acting in Precursor Legacy, it's very well put together, but that should be expected as even the older Crash Bandicoot games on the original PlayStation had rather decent voice acting as time went on, especially given the limited hardware for the time. With the increased disc size and capabilities of the PS2, voice acting in Naughty Dog games only got better with each hardware jump. For the main cast, performances by the likes of Anna Giordano, Max Casella, and the late Warren Burton are phenomenal and really bring the characters to life. This is also in part due to the witty dialogue that the writers gave Daxter that accompanies him as he quips against many different things within the world. Jak is also still very expressive despite being mute, and has actually a death scream voiced by Aaron Lohr, although this role goes uncredited within the game. Supporting characters in the game also all are voiced and can be interacted with at any time with the circle button. And despite not having much dialogue, they're also performed very well with similar performances to that of the main cast that you hear throughout the entire game. Music for the Jak and Daxter series is very atmospheric and relaxing, with many of the tracks not necessarily having too dramatic or climactic feelings about them. Well, except for the game over music when you end up losing at a minigame, that is far too intense for its own good. All the tracks in Jak and Daxter the Precursor Legacy were composed by Josh Mansell, the same composer for all three of the original Crash Bandicoot games on the PlayStation, as well as Crash Team Racing on the original PlayStation as well. Josh Mansell would compose all the tracks for the Jak and Daxter series up until Jak X Combat Racing, where Larry Hopkins would take over as the composer for that game, along with two other composers. With the combination of good voice acting and music, they help make Precursor Legacy a very memorable game overall, with its performances and with the dialogue just being very snappy altogether.
That's it. You cleaned us out. No more power cells.
In the end, I can say that Jak and Daxter the Precursor Legacy was and still is a very well put together game. While others would like a more narrative driven adventures and like the narrative driven adventures of the later games, I will still hold that my favorite of the Jak series has got to be Precursor Legacy because of the focus on gameplay and platforming more than story. While it has a weaker story overall, I will say that the gameplay definitely carries it and is easily a very good collectathon game to begin with, and is really at the peak of when the collectathon genre was really at its height before it eventually started to wane in the early 2000s. In terms of ports, there are 3 ports of the game overall for the Precursor Legacy. First, to celebrate the game's 11th anniversary, there's a PlayStation 3 port and bundled with Jak 2 and 3, while also bumping the game up to 60 frames per second. A year later, a PlayStation Vita port was released of this PlayStation 3 port, and finally, a complete collection which included Jak 1, 2, 3, and Jak X Combat Racing was released for the PlayStation 4 in 2017 by emulating the original PS2 versions of the game. This review uses footage from the PlayStation 4 version of the game, and I will say that try and find an original version of Jak and Daxter the Precursor Legacy for the PlayStation 2 if possible. While only being limited to 480i, the game runs exceptionally well and still looks good even to this day. And the reason for that is each of the versions of the ports have slight problems that slowly add up over time. PS3 versions have sound issues that really get annoying after a while, and has a nasty crashing bug within the final level of the game. The PS4 version has a very bad texture pop-in and texture mess-ups that can be noticed in editing, and sometimes the texture pop-in can be noticed very well, especially in vast areas of green or vast areas of something that uses the same texture. And the Vita version of the game has a massively reduced frame rate, resolution, and frame pacing issues that mar the title very much. It's really a shame that Naughty Dog has long since moved on from the Jak and Daxter franchise, and while I'd love a remaster of this game, I doubt Naughty Dog would be the ones to do it at this point, as much of their focus is on a different style of games nowadays than what Precursor Legacy was. Either way, experience this game if you can, as it's really a fun game to play even after almost 20 years being released. But anyway, I'm gonna end it off right here. This has been Neronium, and I thank you all for watching my review of Jak and Daxter, the Precursor Legacy. See you all next time.